Hey, everybody, I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast, and we are working on this parable in Matthew 22 about this wedding banquet where this king invites everybody to the banquet, and a bunch of people don't really want to come when the time comes to go to the banquet. And then he sends messengers to be like, no, seriously, come. It's going to be really good. And they're like, how about we kill your messenger? And he's really mad about that, understandably. And so he goes and he burns their cities, and he comes back and tells the servants, like, just go get whoever from the street corners or whatever. Like, we're going to have a party. This is happening. And they're like, okay. And they go get people, good and bad. And they bring them in, and then instead of it being over and just being this nice story where poor people and social outsiders get to go to the fancy meal that was meant for the fancy people, instead there's this weird little addendum at the end where somebody is in there who shouldn't be in there, or somebody who didn't really want to be a part of the thing after all. Maybe they just wanted the food. I don't know. And he gets thrown out of the party. So that's the part that we're unpacking right now. Matthew 22, 1 through 14 is what we're working on. I'm going to have Jeff play a little bit of music, and then we'll get cracking on it again. I suppose another way to read this challenging little tidbit at the end of this already challenging parable would be to say that it's like the parable of the sower. Another one of these, the kingdom of heaven is like. Well, I don't know if it overtly says that in Matthew 13, but it's in the midst of a whole bunch of other parables that overtly say that. So in this case, the improperly clad wedding guest who gets judged would be like one of the seeds that falls on soil where it starts to work out, but it is false and doesn't actually produce anything. If this is how we read the passage, then, well, there's kind of an interesting contrast here between, the fig tree, the religious leadership. You got a judgment for people who hold out being fruitful, but actually are not fruitful. And we've spent the last couple of pages looking at what that would look like toward the religious elites. And now here's what it would look like when someone who isn't elite, but has the same flaws, the same pride, holds themselves out as being fruitful, but they really aren't a part of the thing at all. It was false. And then I suppose another way to read this that maybe isn't directly in conflict with any of the other stuff that we've already talked about, but another way to read this big picture wise would just be to say, if you're at the wedding feast thrown by the king, you didn't get there by your own merit. None of these people got there because they were awesome and stylish. They got there because of the grace of the king. They got there because of the decision-making of the king and their ability to hold themselves out, their ability to be of such a state of grooming and personal presentation that it would be appropriate for them to be in the presence of the king. His strength and his power and his wealth and his glory. The only way that these people were made presentable was by the king bringing them in and by the king bestowing his riches upon them so that they would be fit to be at such an event. I know that does not sound like 21st century values, but I think that's the way the thing reads here. And so then if anybody is at this banquet, they're not there once again because of their own merit. They are there because of the providence, the provision, the grace, the patience, the values of this great king. And if that's the case, then this little parable reads all the way back on really the first point of tension with the religious leadership. Boom, turned right to it. That's a good feeling. In Matthew chapter 6. Remember, Matthew 5:17 is like the key pivotal verse for at least the first part of Matthew, maybe the whole thing. That's where Jesus says, don't think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them, to fulfill them. But do you remember what comes after that? He then says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. So if you recall, he's anticipating the question here at the very beginning of his ministry to just regular Joes, to people who are starting to follow him, to the religious leaders who aren't sure if they hate him yet or why, but they're suspicious. He's answering the question like, well, what about the religion we already have? Seems like you're talking about building a new kingdom. What about what we already got? And he's like, no, I'm not here to make that go away. I'm here to fulfill it. Dun. Anyone who breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. Okay. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And then you'll recall he goes on from there to do all of the you've heard it said, but I tell you that statements that demonstrate that even if you're getting things right on the outside, like not adultery, not murder, you're still getting things wrong at the level of the heart because your hearts are screwed up and shot. And the conclusion of this whole flow of thought in Matthew chapter 5 is very obviously, your righteousness can't surpass that of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and their righteousness isn't enough. Therefore, this whole teaching of Jesus leaves things begging for a righteousness that is apart from the law, that is from God. And I think that is what we're seeing hinted at here in Matthew chapter 22. This being clothed in righteousness, this being made suitable to be at the banquet of the king, is something that is work that is done by the king, not by these slipshod, rough-edged guests who really have no business being there except for the impulse and the effort and the work and the riches of the king who decides to have them there. He wasn't just being arbitrarily mean to a poor person who should automatically be the object of our pity. He instead is adding dimension and humanity to poor people and saying poor people are like middle-class people and rich people and all people of every demographic. There's some of them who are going to recognize right and wrong and do that, and there's some of them, some of us, who aren't going to recognize right and wrong and get that right. And in this passage, there's actually a degree of dignity toward people in his culture who didn't have much, acknowledging that no, they're like people and they're a diverse mosaic and spectrum of character and quality, just like any other group of people. But then further, it starts to look like this weird little uncomfortable addendum to the parable of the wedding banquet in Matthew chapter 22 is also somehow a concluding thought or a parallel thought or a completion of the arc set forth in Matthew chapter 5, where Jesus creates a theology crisis. I mean, let's call this thing what it is in Matthew 5, when Jesus says, look, your righteousness would have to surpass that of the Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, the elders, all of this crowd. What he's saying is, good luck. Like, you can't. These people get paid to behave well. They get taken as children and conditioned to behave well. And I'm telling you, they're not good enough. Don't believe me? Well, you might say, well, they've never killed anybody. They've never done any of these other naughty things. And then Jesus goes into the rest of that stuff in Matthew chapter 5 about, well, you've heard it said, don't kill. But I tell you that this hatred or this kind of mockery in this way is akin to the same thing. And you've heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, and he goes on to fulfill that in a way that's much more robust than just like those who are nice to you and be mean to people who aren't. And what he's demonstrating is, look at the level of motives, at the level of who people really are, rich, poor, religious, not religious, whatever. You're flawed. You lack the righteousness of God, and you are all in a situation where, whether you know it or not, you are desperately in need of a righteousness that goes beyond self-control and personal behavior. That stuff isn't good enough to have access to this kingdom whose beautiful values Jesus is painting. I had intended to get much further on this subject matter today, but we got what we got, and we'll keep chipping away at it tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.